She shielded an elderly man without even knowing who he was. Within 24 hours, the whole country was talking about it. Find out what Chuck Norris did when a nurse shed blood for him. Subscribe and write in the comments where you're watching from. The last breath of daylight was beginning to bleed into the edges of the Washington sky as Charles Chuck Norris stepped onto the uneven sidewalk just outside the Veteran Civic Hall. His shadow, tall and unbending, stretched out behind him like a banner carried by history. He was older now, of course. The sharp copper of his youth had faded to silver, and the lines around his eyes bore stories even fists couldn't erase. Yet nothing about him moved with weakness. His gait was deliberate, strong, a rhythm of lived memory and patience. The black coat he wore fluttered faintly with each breeze, and the worn cowboy boots on his feet clicked softly against the concrete like a heartbeat no one dared to challenge. The lecture he'd just given, his third that month, had been for a group of young cadets from the military college. They had sat stiffly at first, expecting a relic or an old man's glory stories, but by the end they leaned forward with hungry eyes, scribbling down every word as he spoke, not of war, not of violence, but of discipline, restraint, and the power of knowing when not to strike. It was a theme he returned to often these days, not because he'd lost the edge, he hadn't, but because age, more than time, was a teacher few survived long enough to understand. There were lessons fists could never deliver. Chuck walked without hurry. The neighborhood was quiet in a way that reminded him of old towns before the noise of headlines and hashtags. Cracked sidewalks, flickering street lights, the occasional car passing without a glance. He liked walking, even if people occasionally recognized him. Tonight, he hoped not to be noticed. Not because he was hiding, he never did, but because he liked these moments of solitude. The rhythm of his breath, the distant thrum of a city both tired and awake. He passed a corner bodega where the owner had once served in the Navy. They nodded at each other. He passed a closed barber shop where the son of an old friend worked weekends. He glanced in the window, but the lights were off. Just ahead, the road dipped slightly into an underlit stretch between apartment complexes, the kind of place cities forgot to care about until something terrible happened there. Chuck didn't flinch. He'd been through jungles at night. This street was a lullaby by comparison, but fate, he knew, never knocked when expected. As he passed beneath a sputtering street lamp, headlights curved behind him, slowed, then halted. A black and white patrol car. He didn't turn immediately. He didn't need to. He could feel the energy inside it shift, the hum of young men too eager to prove themselves and the danger of uniforms worn like armor rather than service. A second later, the sound of a car door slamming confirmed his instinct. "Hey, old man," a voice barked, sharp with that artificial bravado bred in unchecked power. "You lost or something?" Chuck turned slowly, hands in the pockets of his coat. His eyes met those of the approaching officer, a tall, broad-shouldered man no older than 30, his smirk wide, eyes cold. Two others stayed near the car, watching, whispering to each other, laughing. "No," Chuck said simply. The officer stopped a few feet away. "You got ID on you? This isn't a good area for wandering types." Chuck held the man's gaze. "I'm walking home." The second officer stepped out then, this one leaner, nervous, his fingers twitching near his belt. "We just want to make sure you're not casing the buildings. Had a report about a vagrant last week." Chuck said nothing. His silence unnerved them more than defiance ever could. The first officer stepped closer. "What's in the coat?" he demanded, gesturing. Chuck opened the lapel slowly. "Nothing, just a coat." His voice remained even. The third officer now stepped forward, more aggressive. "You trying to be a smartass?" Chuck exhaled. He could hear it in their tones. This wasn't about safety. It wasn't about protocol. It was about pride, control, about boys in the skin of men trying to feel taller by pushing others down. He'd seen it before, in jungles and deserts and bar fights. The kind of men who only swung when they had a crowd. But the urge to fight, to end it swiftly, he pushed down, not because he couldn't, but because he could. One of them knocked his hat off. Another laughed. The first poked a finger into Chuck's chest. "Still feeling tough, old man?" Chuck stared at him. "You don't want to do this." That only made them bolder. From across the street, unseen by them all, a figure emerged from the glow of a hospital's side entrance. A young woman, slim, tired, her scrubs wrinkled from a 12-hour shift, watched the scene unfold. Her name was Kayla. Lewis and her eyes, though weary, were sharp. She knew what trouble looked like, and this? This wasn't a random stop. This was a pack circling an unarmed elder. Her pace quickened. Chuck remained still as the second officer shoved him lightly, then harder. The third one circled, crouched to grab the cane Chuck had laid against the sidewalk. He lifted it mockingly, examining it like it was a toy. "Why don't you try walking without this, Grandpa?" he sneered. Chuck's jaw clenched, not because of the insult, but because of the cowardice. Then Kayla's voice cut through the evening like a siren. "What the hell are you doing?" All three heads turned. The officers stiffened, surprised. Chuck glanced over his shoulder and saw her, small frame, determined stride. He didn't recognize her, but something in her expression spoke volumes. She didn't know who he was, and yet she was coming toward him like he mattered. The lead officer snarled, "Mind your business, lady." But Kayla didn't stop. "You're assaulting an old man." One of the officers raised his hand, flashing a badge like a shield. "Step back." "No," she shouted, stepping onto the curb. "This is wrong. You're on camera." In a swift motion, the nervous officer drew his sidearm, not aiming, but pointing low, warning. His hand trembled slightly. The moment cracked. Chuck stepped forward, and the man panicked. The gun fired once. A sharp report echoed through the street. Kayla jerked back, a red bloom spreading across her upper chest. She crumpled, knees giving way, a soft gasp escaping her lips as she collapsed beside the curb. The world froze. Chuck dropped beside her, one hand catching her head before it hit pavement. Her breath was shallow. His fingers found the wound. It was high, dangerous, bleeding too fast. Behind him, the officers moved. Weapons raised now, commands overlapping in panic and false control. Chuck turned his head slowly, his eyes no longer quiet, no longer patient, no longer willing. In those eyes lived deserts and storms, revolutions and wars. The part of him he'd buried for decades awoke with silent fury. And the old legend rose. The sound of the gunshot seemed to fracture the world into silence. For a brief, terrible instant, nothing moved. No one breathed. Kayla lay crumpled on the sidewalk, her scrubs blooming red beneath the warm yellow spill of the street lamp. Her limbs were limp, her eyes half closed, and her hand twitched once before going still. Chuck Norris, kneeling beside her, pressed his palm against the wound, feeling the fierce, hot pulse of blood slipping between his fingers. Her breathing was ragged, weak. His jaw clenched, the pressure in his chest a slow-building roar, and still he didn't move beyond what was necessary to keep her alive. The officers stood several feet away now, their weapons raised, hands trembling. The gun that had fired still smoked faintly in its holster. The one who pulled the trigger, young, twitchy, pale, was the first to speak. She "She jumped in front of me," he shouted, his voice high and unstable. "I didn't mean to. She surprised me." Chuck said nothing. His focus remained on Kayla. Her blood was warm, seeping through his fingers with a rhythm that was already slowing. He looked at her face, young, determined even in unconsciousness, and something ancient stirred in him. It wasn't rage. Rage was hot and blind. This was colder, deeper. A decision forged in the quietest part of his being, the place where justice was not a concept but a code. A code he had lived by long before badges became symbols of fear and law lost its spine. Behind him, the tallest officer took a step forward, aiming his gun directly at Chuck's back. "Hands where I can see them. Now." Chuck didn't comply. He slowly lifted Kayla in his arms, her body light but limp, her head resting against his shoulder like a fallen comrade. The blood from her wound now soaked into his shirt, into the fabric and skin like a mark. One of the officers shouted again, but Chuck ignored him. His boots scraped the pavement as he stood, his full height rising against the night like an immovable wall. The officer's voice cracked. "Put her down. You're interfering with—" Chuck turned his head, just enough for his eyes to meet the speaker's. He didn't need to say anything. The look was enough. It silenced them. And then he moved. Not toward them, but away, calmly, steadily. He walked down the middle of the street, cradling Kayla with both arms, her head pressed against his chest. One of the officers ran forward as if to intercept, but something about Chuck's posture, his unhurried steps, the way he walked without fear or pause, froze him mid-stride. He hesitated, looked back at his companions, and did nothing. Chuck kept walking. The city had grown quiet again, the noise of the world shrinking behind him. Car engines in the distance, a siren somewhere blocks away, the soft hush of wind through narrow alleys. He didn't think about his age. He didn't think about the burning in his legs or the weight of the woman in his arms. He thought only of distance, of blood loss, of the hospital just past the rise of the next hill, the familiar red cross above the doors. Kayla stirred slightly, a groan slipping from her lips, almost too soft to hear. He looked down, saw her eyes flutter open for a fraction of a second, then close again. Her skin was pale, lips trembling. He whispered to her without realizing it, words of encouragement, not promises. He never made promises he couldn't keep, but assurances carved from steel. Behind him, no one followed. Ahead of him, the street opened like a stage, the sidewalk bent toward light. A passing car slowed, its headlights sweeping across his figure, revealing the crimson bloom on his shirt and the unmoving form in his arms. The driver stared, rolled down the window. "Need help?" the man called, voice wary. Chuck didn't break stride. "No, stay back." Something in his tone, calm but dangerous, compelled obedience. The car idled for a moment, then pulled over. Someone started recording with their phone. More people emerged as he approached the hospital. A man smoking on the corner dropped his cigarette. A woman walking her dog gasped audibly. A nurse in blue scrubs, just stepping out for a breath of air, stared in disbelief as the man approached with blood running down his side and a young woman in his arms. She recognized the uniform before the face. "She's one of ours," the nurse cried out, running ahead and pushing through the emergency entrance. The automatic doors parted. Inside, chaos bloomed. Doctors rushed forward, a gurney appeared as if from nowhere, and hands reached out to take Kayla from Chuck. But he didn't let go immediately. His fingers were stiff, curved protectively around her. One of the attending physicians, a tall black man in his 50s, stepped closer. "We've got her," he said firmly, Let go." Chuck looked at him. Slowly, he laid her on the gurney, brushing hair from her blood-stained forehead with a tenderness that made everyone around them pause. Then the gurney disappeared behind swinging doors. Chuck stood there for a long time, chest heaving. The emergency staff turned their attention to him, offering him a chair, a blanket, water. He refused it all. A nurse tried to wipe the blood from his hands. He pulled them away. The attending, Dr. Hayes, finally said, "Sir, we need to examine you. Are you injured?" "No," Chuck replied. "She is. That's what matters." The media arrived within minutes. Police cars, too, but not the ones from before. The responding officers at the hospital recognized him instantly. One even whispered his name under his breath, as if invoking a legend. They didn't question him. They didn't ask for statements. They stood back and waited. The tension hung in the air like a wire stretched to its limit. Someone showed the security footage. Someone leaked the cell phone video. The internet responded as it always did, first with disbelief, then with fury. Commentators argued, hashtags trended, the city's police chief was called out of bed. But all of it was noise. Inside the waiting room, Chuck sat alone. His hands rested on his knees, fingers still stained red. Nurses passed him quietly, some recognizing him, others simply sensing the gravity that hung around his frame like mist. No one asked questions. No one dared interrupt the silence he wore like armor. He thought of her. He thought of the way she stepped forward when no one else had, of how she'd taken the bullet meant for him without hesitation, not because she knew who he was, but because she saw injustice and refused to ignore it. That kind of courage couldn't be taught. It was instinct. It was rare. And it was why she had to survive. After hours that felt like days, Dr. Hayes returned. His expression was grave, but not hopeless. "She made it through surgery," he said. "It was close, damage to the subclavian artery, but we managed to stop the bleeding. She's stable, not conscious yet, but stable." Chuck stood. "Can I see her?" The doctor hesitated, then he nodded. Briefly. In the ICU, Kayla lay still, wrapped in white and wires, machines humming around her like watchful sentinels. Chuck stepped to her bedside and looked down at her face. Pale, yes, but still fierce in its quietness. Her hand, small and fragile, rested atop the blanket. He took it gently in his. He didn't speak. He just sat. And the legend, the warrior, the man who had walked through fire and shadow, sat beside the woman who had thrown herself into harm's way for a stranger. Because right now, that was all that mattered. Justice would come. The world would respond. But tonight, it was about her, and the choice she made without hesitation. To protect. The machines in the ICU hummed with steady precision, their beeps marking each fragile second that Kayla clung to life. Chuck remained seated beside her, unmoving, his weathered hand still wrapped gently around hers. The nurses had come and gone in soft footsteps, checking vitals, adjusting IV lines, whispering updates to one another. None of them dared interrupt him. Even the doctors walked with careful reverence when they entered the room, their voices lower than usual, their eyes flicking between Kayla and the silent man who hadn't left her side. The hospital lights were dimmed for the night, but Chuck wasn't tired. Fatigue didn't reach him. Not now. His body might have aged, but the core of who he was, what he was, remained unbroken. A lifetime of combat, discipline, and purpose pulsed beneath his skin like coiled wire. And as he sat watching the rise and fall of Kayla's chest, his mind was no longer in that room. It had traveled back, to the alley, to the heat of the bullet, to the faces of the men who had dared to hurt her. The blood had soaked through her uniform. Her body had gone limp in his arms. She had nearly died because they feared her defiance more than their own cowardice. They had drawn their weapons not out of necessity, but out of weakness. It wasn't about protocol. It wasn't even about power. It was about the sickness that crept into men when authority became a mask for violence. Chuck had seen it overseas, and now he'd seen it on his own streets. He stood quietly and released her hand, placing it gently atop the blanket. She didn't stir. The nurse at the front desk nodded silently as he walked past. No one stopped him. Outside, the hospital parking lot was bathed in a thin layer of mist. The air had turned colder. Street lights flickered overhead. Chuck's boots clicked against the pavement with calm finality. He didn't look around. He didn't hesitate. He had no plan, no map, but he knew exactly where to go. Justice had already been delayed. It would not be denied. The precinct wasn't far. He knew the city better than most of the men who patrolled it, knew its weak spots, its blind corners, its hidden doors. He also knew that the officers who had assaulted him and shot Kayla weren't in a holding cell. Not yet. There would be reports to write, supervisors to placate, narratives to build. They would still be in motion, still feeling untouchable. That would change. Chuck moved like a shadow through the city, slipping between buildings, cutting through alleys, unseen and unchallenged. He no longer wore the blood-stained shirt. He'd borrowed a plain one from a donation bin near the hospital and left behind the old one with quiet precision, as if shedding a skin. The new shirt fit tightly over his chest, but he didn't care. He didn't dress for comfort. He dressed for what was coming. By the time he reached the rear entrance of the precinct, the fog had thickened. The back lot was nearly empty, save for a few parked cruisers and the long white van used for prisoner transfers. Chuck crouched beside a loading ramp, listening. One of the officers, he didn't know which, was inside the annex, talking loudly on the phone. Chuck recognized the voice instantly. It was the youngest one, the twitchy one, the one who'd fired the shot. Chuck stepped out of the shadows. The door opened, and the officer stepped outside, still holding his phone. He didn't see Chuck at first. He lit a cigarette with shaking hands, muttering to someone on the other end of the call. Chuck moved. It took less than a second. The officer didn't even have time to scream. Chuck struck his wrist with a clean, practiced motion, disarming him of the weapon holstered at his side. The phone clattered to the ground. A second blow sent the young man spinning, collapsing against the van with a groan. Chuck crouched beside him. "You pulled the trigger," he said quietly. The officer gasped, trying to crawl backward, but Chuck caught his collar and yanked him forward again. "She jumped in front of you, remember? That was your story." "I didn't mean—" Chuck pressed a finger to his lips. "Intent is a luxury you forfeited." He struck again. The officer went silent. Chuck dragged him behind the van and left him there, unconscious but alive. There was no satisfaction in the blow, no pleasure. It was duty. It was the price of cowardice. Inside the building, the other two officers were still on duty. Chuck slipped through the side door, entering the maintenance corridor that led to the break room. The hallway lights flickered overhead, and somewhere a vending machine buzzed faintly. He could hear laughter echoing through the thin walls. The two men were watching something on a television screen. A sports highlight, maybe, or a movie. They had no idea. He entered the room without a sound. They didn't see him until he was standing between them. The taller one, the leader, rose first, eyes widening. You! Chuck hit him squarely in the jaw. The man stumbled backward into the table, crashing through chairs. The second officer lunged, but Chuck was faster. He blocked the blow, twisted the man's arm behind his back, and drove him into the wall with a controlled strike. The thud echoed down the hall. The leader tried to recover, grabbing a baton from the table, but Chuck disarmed him with a kick, sending the weapon clattering to the floor. The man shouted in fury, lunged again, fists swinging wildly. Chuck moved like water. Each blow was calculated. A rib cracked, a shoulder dislocated, a knee buckled. They weren't fights. They were lessons. When both men lay groaning on the floor, too dazed to resist, Chuck crouched between them. His voice was calm. She took a bullet because you couldn't control your fear. You mocked a man who didn't fight back because you thought that made you powerful. He looked each of them in the eye. You should have walked away. Then he stood. He didn't linger. The hallway cameras had recorded everything. That was intentional. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't ashamed. If the law wouldn't protect people like Kayla, then it had no right to protect the cowards who wore its uniform like a weapon. He walked back into the night, leaving the precinct in silence. News broke by dawn. The videos flooded every channel, every feed, every screen. The footage from the hospital, from the phone in the parking lot, from the precinct security cameras, it told a story clearer than any statement could. The internet lit up. Protesters gathered before breakfast. By noon, the police chief issued a statement. Internal Affairs launched an investigation. The mayor condemned the incident. The officers were suspended, then arrested. Charges followed. But none of that mattered to Chuck. He had returned to the hospital before the sun had risen. Kayla was still unconscious, her body surrounded by machines, but her vitals had improved. Her heart beat stronger. Her lungs worked without aid. The doctors said it was a miracle. Chuck knew better. It wasn't a miracle. It was her. She had chosen to stand between violence and innocence, and that choice had nearly cost her life. She had no fame, no weapons, no backup. Just instinct. Just courage. He sat beside her once more and waited. Not because he had to, but because he wasn't finished. Not until she opened her eyes. The hospital was unusually quiet in the early hours before sunrise, the kind of silence that clings to corridors like fog, heavy and uncertain. The overnight staff moved with hushed urgency, not wanting to disturb the fragile stillness surrounding room 207, where Kayla lay suspended between life and death. Machines tracked her heartbeat, her oxygen levels, the rhythm of her blood, a mechanical symphony sustaining what her body could no longer do alone. Beneath her eyelids there was no flicker of movement. Her face, once animated with kindness and defiance, was pale and still, touched now only by the pulse of dim light and the whisper of machines. Chuck had not moved in hours. He sat in the same chair he had occupied since returning from the precinct, his body motionless, his eyes fixed on hers. The violence of the night, his precision, his fury, had drained from him, leaving behind a quieter intensity, one born not of anger but of hope. He hadn't spoken to anyone since slipping back into the room. No one had asked questions. No one had dared. The weight of him was like gravity. Nurses walked around him as though he were part of the building itself. There was a knock on the glass just after 6 a.m. Dr. Hayes stood on the other side of the door, clipboard in hand, his expression cautious. Chuck stood slowly and stepped outside into the hallway, closing the door behind him. "She's stable," the doctor said, eyes scanning the chart. The bleeding's controlled, her vitals are improving. We're monitoring for neurological trauma, but so far, she's fighting." "She always was," Chuck replied, voice hoarse. Hayes studied him. "What you did, bringing her here like that, it saved her life. If you'd waited even 5 more minutes—" "I didn't wait," Chuck said. The two men stood in silence for a moment, both watching the still figure inside the room. "Media's outside now," Hayes added, quieter. "News vans, reporters, protesters too. I don't know how long we can keep this floor quiet." Chuck's gaze didn't move. Let them wait. The doctor nodded and left him there. Word had spread through the hospital like wildfire. Some staff had known Kayla personally. She was respected, admired. Others had known her only in passing but had felt the echo of what she had done. Her shift was supposed to have ended an hour before the shooting. She had stayed late to finish a patient report. That choice had placed her on the street, in front of danger. That choice had saved a man's life and nearly cost her own. No one in the hospital saw her as a victim. She was something more, something braver. Chuck returned to her side and resumed his silent vigil. Outside, the city was waking up, but inside that room, time remained suspended. Rumors twisted through the air like vines, and camera crews circled the block like vultures waiting for the final act. But Chuck didn't care. He wasn't there for the headlines. He was there for her. Around 10 that morning, as the world outside boiled with outrage and media noise, Kayla stirred. It was small at first, a twitch of her fingers, then a flutter beneath her eyelids. A nurse noticed and called for Hayes. Chuck leaned forward, his face inches from hers, watching, waiting. Her eyelids rose slowly, like someone waking from a terrible dream, and for a moment her gaze was unfocused. Then she saw him. She tried to speak, but the words came out as a whisper. He leaned closer. "You're safe," he said softly. "You're here." Her lips moved again. This time he caught the word. "Alive?" He nodded. "Thanks to you." Tears gathered in the corners of her eyes. She tried to smile, but the pain stopped her. Her hand moved slightly, seeking his. He took it. Dr. Hayes entered, flanked by 2 nurses. They began the routine assessments, checking her pupils, asking questions, testing reflexes, but Kayla kept her eyes on Chuck. "You didn't leave." "Not for a second." The doctors asked her to rest, but she refused to close her eyes. It was as if keeping them open proved something, that she had made it, that she was still herself. Chuck stayed until she drifted off again, her breathing deeper, steadier. The hospital erupted in applause when the news spread. She was awake. She was going to live. It wasn't just relief, it was celebration. Orderlies high-fived in the elevator, nurses wept in the locker rooms, doctors who rarely cracked smiles allowed themselves one, just this once. Someone hung a paper banner across the staff room. "Kayla Strong." A group of nurses started a donation fund to help her with recovery costs. Another volunteer printed T-shirts with her name beside a heart-shaped stethoscope. And outside, the protest doubled in size. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everything she stood for. Chuck watched from her window. He didn't care for spectacle. He didn't trust cameras or crowds, but even he had to admit, this was bigger than one night, bigger than him. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Rachel, one of the senior nurses. She held a small box in her hands and looked sheepish. "I figured she'd want her things," she said. She left them in her locker, her badge, her earrings, a book she'd been reading. Chuck took the box and set it on the nightstand. "She'll be glad you brought it," he said. Rachel hesitated. "They're saying you did something, that you went to the precinct. Chuck didn't answer. They say you handled it. Still, silence. I just wanted to say thank you, she added, not just for what you did, but for sitting with her. She doesn't have family in the city, just a few cousins out of state. No one was coming until you. Chuck looked at her. I wasn't going to let her be alone. Rachel nodded and left quietly. By noon, the mayor had issued a formal statement. The 3 officers involved were under investigation. One had been hospitalized with injuries sustained in a non-documented incident, but no charges had been filed. Yet. Public pressure mounted. Petitions gained signatures by the thousands. The hospital lobby overflowed with flowers. Letters poured in from as far as California and Michigan. One envelope was postmarked from a veterans center in Montana with a simple note inside. She's the kind of American we salute. But Chuck didn't care about politics. He cared that Kayla was awake. That night, long after visiting hours had ended, she woke again. Are they gone? She asked. He understood what she meant. They won't hurt anyone else. I was scared, she admitted, her voice a rasp. So was I. She turned her head slowly. Did you fight them? He didn't lie. Yes. Did you win? He looked at her, and for the first time since that terrible night, he smiled. I didn't lose. She chuckled weakly, and it ended in a wince. You're a strange man. Some people say that. The machines beeped steadily around them. Her color was returning. Her strength, too. You carried me, she said after a moment. Didn't you? I ran, he replied. Her eyes welled with tears again, but this time she didn't try to hide them. Why? He looked at her hand in his. Because you would have done the same for me. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was full. Full of understanding, of gratitude, of something shared that didn't need to be spoken. They had crossed a threshold together, survived something unthinkable. And now they were bound not by what had happened, but by what had been chosen. By morning, she was strong enough to sit up for a few minutes. Nurses wheeled in breakfast, and she actually laughed when she saw the hospital's sad attempt at oatmeal. Chuck made a dry comment about tactical rations being more appetizing, and for a few minutes it felt like peace. Outside, cameras still rolled, but inside room 207, something more important unfolded. A legend had risen, a nurse had endured, and together they had proven that courage wasn't about power or fame, it was about standing, when standing alone was the only choice. And surviving, together. A week had passed since the night the city held its breath, a week since bullets flew and silence followed, since blood was spilled not for crime, but for principle, since a woman stood between power and decency and nearly died for it. The hospital where Kayla had once been just another face in blue had now become a place of reverence, not for the building, not even for the machines that hummed behind its sterile walls, but for the story that lived inside room 207. The nurses still paused at the door, even if only to glance inside. Some brought flowers. Others just stood quietly, as if in the presence of something larger than all of them, something sacred. Kayla had improved quickly, more quickly than anyone had expected. Her youth, her resilience, and perhaps something unnameable inside her, the same thing that had driven her forward that night, kept her steady through pain and fatigue. She was walking now, slowly, with help, the IV pole trailing beside her like a loyal companion. She no longer asked if the officers had been arrested. She knew they had. She no longer asked if the video had gone viral. She knew it had, and she no longer asked why Chuck had done what he did. because the answer was already living in her chest, beating beneath the bruises and the sutures. Chuck had stayed by her side for the first 4 days, sleeping only in a chair when he allowed himself to sleep at all. But then, one morning, he was gone. She woke to find his coat folded over the back of her chair, his hat hanging from the hook by the door. No note, no explanation, just absence. The nurses told her he had walked out before sunrise and no one had seen him since. In truth, Chuck had needed air, not oxygen or sunlight, but something deeper. He had needed quiet. He walked the length of the National Mall before the city stirred, his boots slow against the stone, his breath visible in the cold spring air. The monuments stood tall and still as they always had, but for the first time in years, Chuck didn't feel small beside them. Not because he had proven something, but because someone else had. He made his way to the Lincoln Memorial, climbed the steps with the patience of a man not in a hurry, and stood before the statue of the man who had held a nation together with words and silence. Chuck looked up at the solemn face carved in stone and sat down heavily on the top step. He didn't pray. He didn't speak. He simply sat. The way men do when they have seen too much, lost too much, and know that no sound could ever say what needed to be said. A pair of joggers passed behind him, whispering his name. A child stopped and pointed. Someone took a photo, but none of it touched him. He was elsewhere. That afternoon, Kayla was discharged. The media had been alerted despite the hospital's best efforts, and a small crowd had formed outside. Journalists pressed forward, cameras raised, microphones shoved toward her face. But Kayla, now in a simple gray hoodie and jeans, walked past them with her chin high, her eyes clear. She said nothing. A security guard flanked her on one side, Rachel on the other. As they reached the curb, a familiar truck pulled into view. Chuck stepped out of the driver's seat. Kayla smiled. He didn't say anything. He just opened the door for her. She climbed in, settled into the passenger seat, and exhaled as if she had been holding her breath for days. Chuck got in behind the wheel and pulled away. The cameras kept flashing, but neither of them looked back. They didn't speak for the first few minutes. The city blurred past the windows, and Kayla watched the sidewalks as if seeing them for the first time. Then she turned to him. "You left," she said. "I needed to breathe." She nodded. "Me too." They drove in silence for a while longer. Eventually, Chuck pulled into a quiet park, shaded with old trees and empty benches. A place few people knew, fewer visited. They sat there, side by side in the truck, the engine ticking quietly as it cooled. "Are you okay?" he asked finally. "I think I will be," she answered. Chuck nodded slowly. "You don't have to speak to reporters, or politicians, or anyone. You did enough." "I know," she said, "but maybe I want to. Not for them, for the ones who don't speak." He looked at her, studying her face. There was no fame in her eyes, no hunger for recognition, just clarity. "You'll be good at it," he said. "I don't want to be good at it," she replied. "I just want to say the truth." Later that day, Chuck walked her up the steps of her apartment. She still moved carefully, but the strength in her legs was returning. She paused at the door. "I don't think I ever said thank you," she murmured. "You did," he said, "every time you opened your eyes." She laughed quietly. "That's a very Chuck thing to say." He smiled. "I've been told." She opened the door. A vase of flowers sat on the kitchen counter. Letters were stacked on the table. The couch looked inviting in a way it never had before. Chuck didn't come in. She didn't ask him to. Some things didn't need ceremony. 2 days later, Kayla gave her first and only statement to the press. She stood on the steps of the hospital where it had all started, wearing her badge around her neck and a jacket over her heel and shoulder. She spoke clearly, without notes. "I'm not a hero," she said. "I'm just a nurse. I saw something wrong, and I did what I hoped someone would do for my brother, my father, my neighbor. I didn't know who he was, and it didn't matter. I'd do it again." She paused, then added, "But I hope next time I won't have to." The crowd erupted in applause. Reporters shouted questions, but she walked away before answering a single one. That night, Chuck watched the footage from a diner TV while sipping black coffee. No one in the diner recognized him, or if they did, they said nothing. He appreciated that. The waitress brought him a second cup without asking. He tipped her double and left before the late news began. Weeks passed, then months. Kayla returned to the hospital, first as a patient, then as a visitor, then as a nurse again. Not full-time, not right away, but enough. Enough to feel like herself again. She trained new hires. She covered night shifts when others couldn't. She sat with the families of the dying and laughed in the break room when someone brought cupcakes. Life returned in pieces. Chuck drifted back into obscurity. He resumed his quiet routines, morning walks, teaching self-defense to teenagers at the community center, volunteering at a local veteran shelter. People recognized him from time to time, but he never confirmed anything. He preferred to be the man who lived 3 blocks down, the one who fixed his own truck and bought too much coffee. Every now and then, he and Kayla crossed paths, sometimes at the park, sometimes at a grocery store, once at a vigil for another victim of violence. They didn't talk long. They didn't need to. A nod, a smile, that was enough. Then, on the anniversary of the night everything changed, Chuck returned to the hospital. Not through the front door, but the back. Not for attention. Just to leave something. A small envelope. No name, just a note inside. For the woman who didn't flinch. And beside it, a medal. One he had kept from a war no one talked about anymore. Kayla found it the next morning. She read the note twice, smiled, and tucked it into her locker. She didn't tell anyone. Some things are meant to be kept quiet. That night, she sat on her balcony, the city murmuring softly below, and wrote in her journal, "He didn't want to be remembered, but I will never forget him. Not because he fought, but because he stayed. When it mattered most, he stayed." And somewhere across the city, Chuck sat alone beneath a sky littered with stars, the air cool against his skin, and the silence surrounding him not empty but whole. The kind of silence that speaks louder than words. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more. Check out our other videos for more powerful stories like this one, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for watching.